And thank you again for this conversation.
Thank you so much, Mauricio. That was wonderful. So let me start by thanking, well, Jonathan and Miqueas for putting this space together, for your work, Mauricio, which was a pleasure to read, and also for everybody here because it's been, and still is, very stressful week. So what I'm going to do is to trace like a series of questions and provocations. And of course, you know, Mauricio, feel free to pick up whichever you feel most productive for the type of feedback that you want to gather from this session. And let me just start by saying that it's just an excellent paper, that your close reading of Senghor's poem was beautiful, and that I learned a lot from reading it, and that your contribution is very clear and much necessary. I was particularly engaged by how the paper traces South-to-South connections and providing these, you know, different geographic networks than the Anglocentric ones or Francocentric ones, right? And as you define them, right, these are South Atlantic networks where tropicalismo meets the imaginations of several Luso-Afro-Atlantic coordinates, bringing up the issue of margins and overlapping territories. You also propose, you know, the multi-centralized configurations that you borrow from Pino, where you present the reader with a nuanced tracing of South Black Atlantic exchanges and Senghor's propositions on, for instance, Afropolitanism, right? So I wanted to stick with this question of geography. In a way, you know, the paper reminded me of kind of like a scholar called Charmaine Nelson, and her latest book is on slavery, geography, and empire in 19th century marine landscape of Montreal and Jamaica. So for me, it was really interesting how in conversation with your work, she deploys colony to colony approaches in which she proposes to conceptualize, for instance, a second middle passage between Jamaica and Canada, right? So trying to think these other geographies where there is this trace of trauma. And you know, by way of Said, she proposes that the work of imperialism is also the reimagining of geography. But in the case of your paper, this reimagination is one that counters or that this identifies with such imperial imaginations, right? So I guess the first question I had is precisely regarding the role of imagination in your work in relation to geographic networks. And, you know, you just mentioned how you're, you know, in your dissertation title, it's performing Afro-Atlantic imaginations. So I was interested in how you refer to imagination, specifically in your mentioning with Diana Taylor, right? And, you know, I wanted to know more about the relationship of this in your paper, specifically with the relation of the performativity of the speeches, with poetics, embodiment, and the tracing of these imaginative geographies. So I guess another way of framing this would be, you know, how do you see the relation between imagination and memory in tandem with embodiment and geography playing out? The second side of you know, questions that I was thinking about when reading your paper regarded terminology, right? So the paper brings into play a productive tension of different terms. You have the Black Atlantic, Négritude, Afro-Atlantic margins, Luso-Afro-Atlantic geographies, right? And so my question would be, you know, how to, so basically, what does the productive tension of these terms bring to you in terms of these alternate geographies that you're tracing? One challenge that Gilroy had with the Black Atlantic was to overcome the conception of a nation state, right? To produce these transnational connections. So I was thinking about the historic moment that you refer to in your text, where it seems like a transnational model of someone like Senghor is still very much grounded in the idea of a nation state, or at least in the sense that he is the president of a nation, right? So is this contradictory in any sense, or what are the strategies in your view that Senghor uses to avoid racial nationalisms while, you know, being the president of a nation? Or could you speak a bit more about the tensions you want to bring out in the essay when juxtaposing these terms, you know, in relation to, let's say, third world alliances, right? And, you know, is this where translocal solidarities come into play? What are the relations between reconciliation, solidarity, and a poetics of forgiveness that you bring in your text, right? So this brings me to maybe a proposition, you know, continuing with the theme of solidarity and geography, which is, I really appreciate how you bring all the time these words that refer to the land and the sea. So you talk about tides, high seas, right, regarding territorial sovereignty. And it reminded me of Tiffany Letalo King's book, The Black Shoals, Offshore Formations of Black and Native Studies. And what she does is she brings this figure of the shoal, which is like an inlet, like a liminal space between sea and land. And I'm gonna like read her text because I think it's really, it speaks also to these geographies that you're tracing, where she says, the word shoal has a number of meanings. Geological sources define it as the area in which the sea or a body of water becomes shallow, but it can also be a process, right? And at the same time, it is a geological formation, sometimes a sandbar or a coral reef. But the black shoal, which is what she brings, right, is this idea of a moment of friction at the production of a new topography. And so this is an analytical and methodological location that constitutes a moment of convergence, gathering, reassembling, coming together, or apart, right? So what she says is that she offers the space of the shoal as simultaneously land and sea, both to fracture the notion that the Black diaspora is like overdetermined by rootlessness, and also bringing water into play to kind of like destabilize this notion that indigenous studies only might refer to land, for instance, right? So how to think about these different geographies. So, you know, what would happen? This is just a provocation. What would happen if we think of Négritude in Brazil within the framework of the shoal, for instance, right? And so this question of, you know, coming together or apart brings me back to what you point out in terms of harmony in Négritude. And so, and excuse me because I'm an art historian. So like when I was reading, you know, your beautiful close reading of Senghor's poem, I was thinking about the work of Rosana Paulino. So I wanted to share my screen so I can, I can't share my screen. Let me see. Maybe, or should I just drop an image of the work? Oh, I can share my screen now, thanks. So I was thinking about this work. Oops, what did I do here? Uh-oh, wait, this is, well, it's okay. No, wait. Do you see the work in this part of the screen or is it too small?
Oh, yes, we can see
Atlético Vermelho,
right?
Wait,
yeah.
Let me try to do it again, but I don't know why it came up with, or maybe here. Oh, this is better. Do you see it now?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. So yeah, so as you can see, this work is titled Red Atlantic, right? Which is something that you, in your footnotes, you talk about, you know, different ways of framing this space, right? And, you know, phrases in the poem like blood is lost in a sea of blackness, and also those reference to bodies of water, timelessness, and the resilience of blackness present in Senghor are, I mean, I feel that like there is some resonance here with Paulino, right, and what she's trying to do. And also when you suggest that saudade might be the remembrance of a misplaced temporality. So what she's doing here, basically, she's taking these pictures from ethnographic images like those of Augustal, right? But as you see, then she sutures them, right? So there is this conceptualization of erasure through this process of suturing. And you know, in thinking of Luso, oh wait, I'm trying to go to the next slide here. Here. Oh wait. Okay, there we go. Sorry. So in thinking about Luso-tropicalism, you know, and the idea of Portugal taking a place here, and how the violence that was at play in that history, right? I find this detail, right, of the bleeding tile very in line to the topics that you touch upon, right? So basically what I'm trying to do by bringing Paulino's work, right, and how she openly questions the fallacies of the racial democracy, is that you mentioned that the past of colonial violence for Senghor is converted into matter to achieve universal harmony. But as we see in Paulino's teaching, right, it is not harmonious in the traditional mode. It is an amended, but it's still in pieces, right, so to speak. So there is a recognition of violence, even where there are reparative modes at play. So how do you think Senghor's universal harmony addresses these processes, right? It seems both that temporality and what you call the commitment that combines the deterritorialization of the past with future fertility becomes a key component, right, of thinking these modes of suturing. And also you mentioned, and I'm gonna end here this share screening. You mentioned how the poet emerges as a peacemaker of diseased worlds, right? So are these worlds diseased? And if they are, how do we conceptualize of that presence that still lingers, right? This like Hunting's relationship between these phantasms and Senghor's optimism. And maybe this is a relationship of what happens when you know, how is Senghor, the poet, interfering with Senghor as a diplomat, right? So what is the relationship between diplomacy and poetry that makes for a Bahia-Dakar exchange and for a dictatorship to support decolonization in Africa? How do you see the relation between speech and poetry playing out? For instance, is the juxtaposition making the poetry more political and the speech is more poetic? Like these relationships that you trace are very interesting. And then I guess just to finalize, the idea of sound, of course, and the fact that you ended the presentation, you know, with sound. So, you know, Senghor's book is a nocturne, right? You described also the tradition of the elegy as a song. Senghor himself talks about shadow voices and singing saudages, right? So can you speak a bit more about how the principles of elegy modified within Négritude and its relation to something like sounded poetics, right? And one area of further differentiation might be the differences of elegies in dialogue with the oral traditions, oral as in the ear, right? What happens when you shift to the ear? Because when you talk about the political speeches, these are also meant to be heard, right? Yeah. So what happens with that connection? And I guess just like finally, I really enjoy how you propose that Senghor is almost cannibalizing Freire in the modernista sense with this concept of deviation, right? And I enjoy how these deviations that come from reading Brazil through Africa's reading of Brazil leave Freire in a kind of shoal, so to speak. So yeah, I mean, those are the initial thoughts I had. And of course, feel free to start wherever. Or if, you know, people want to chime in, because clearly, I mean, there's definitely people that are more, you know, capable of reading sound than me. So this is a question that your work and Senghor's works opens very much.
Thank you very much. Can I start by? Yeah, okay, very nice. Thank you, Isabela. Thank you very much for the reading. So that's very close and deep and provocative reading. I really appreciate the questions. So, and I will try to dialogue with the comments. So I definitely will ask you for some references that you have mentioned. And yes, very nice, very nice. So let's try to pick up some questions here. So they're very, very nice and deep questions. So you have mentioned, Isabela, about this role of imagination, no, which is like in the title of the dissertation, and also it's very important in the article, no. So, and here as imagination, I refer mostly to the political scientist and historian Benedict Anderson, no, when he thinks about this kind of long historical perspective in the building up of imaginations about nation state and nation devices. No, he talks a lot about museums, for example, but also about maps, no, and census as devices that helps to create, let's say, imaginations, no, in a very pragmatic and practical way, no. And I also like that idea of Benedict Anderson in the way that he brings an idea of performances also when he thinks about the nation, no? And I think that's interesting to me because I can find some connections between Anderson's reading about the nation as a kind of performance, as a kind of repetitive act of embodiments, and also as a kind of ritual in the anthropological sense, no? I find some convergences between Anderson and Diana Taylor in that way, no? So because when Anderson thinking about imagination as a ritual, he's thinking about Victor Turner, no, and this anthropology of the body and the body that create, no, gestures and that give existence for personalities or communities, no, and that's the way that I conceive also my analysis about the first World Festival of Negro Arts, no, so. So there is a sort of connection between this reflection about the nation as a kind of pedagogical ritual, no, created through some devices, which in the case of the Senegal, which has a very complex history in terms of the independence in this decolonization process during the 60s. So there is a long debate about that. But I think that's very interesting because I can find some connections between the idea of Anderson as important figures of the political thought, creating devices to imagine the nation, and the way that Senghor acts as poet, and also as a political figure. No, before being a president of Senegal, Senghor has a long history in politics. No, as a representative of Senegal in the National Assembly in France, and as a political figure from the Socialist Party, first in France, and then in the different parties that African politics created, knowing the transition from the post-colonial period. And it's very interesting because Senghor, he has a very important image to conceive his own poetry, and he developed this in different poems, which is the idea of rhythm image. And maybe this makes some connections with the idea of the sound that you have asked me about, Isabela. And he has some beautiful definitions about these ideas, about how poem and how aesthetics in the African context has a deep connection with the body, with the rhythm, no? And in some way, I conceived the festival, no, as a kind of huge projection of this idea of image rhythm that Senghor develops in poem, no? And I think that's the way also that Senghor tried to address as a man of his time, no? And I will try to dialogue with the question of Rosana Paulino, which is a very complex one and pose other questions, no? But as a man of his time, I think that the way that he's looking for a reconciliation, no, between the old colonial empire and old colonial relation with a post-colonial period, this kind of redemption, no, has to do with this festival. No, this festival is a kind of transnational device that will be able to create a scenario in the way that Diana Taylor talks about the way that body, no, that body is posed like in presence, no, that these scenarios that make reference to coloniality, but also to the subversions of this colonial order, no. So I think Senghor tried to address this transition between an old colonial period to a post-colonial order by using this festival as a kind of big metaphor no, about this image reading, no, in the way that not only African countries, but African diasporic communities, no, out of Africa would be able to keep connected, engaged, and committed to a new order, no? And I think that's one way that I think that's important to connect this idea of imagination as devices with the poetry of Senghor and also with his practice, no, as a politician. I think that's one way that I envision these connections, Isabela. And this, like, I'm searching for the contradictions of this connection between politics and aesthetics since the first chapter, no? Because the first chapter also tried to understand how this festival was proposed, organized, no? As a kind of hair of previous festivals, no? We had during the 50s 2 important meetings of Black intellectuals in Europe, and the first World Festival was a kind of continuation, but it was different because it was the first time in a nation state in Africa in a post-colonial period. So, and on one side, Senghor is kind of creating this device of the festival as a connection with African diasporic communities worldwide, but he's also at the same time proposing a project to the nation. And I think that leads me to your questions about terminology, no? Especially the idea of nation state and this relation to a third alliance, no? That you have mentioned. So you please ask me again if I misunderstood the question. So you are, I try to make my notes here, and to not only to Senghor but to the to other poets like Aimé Césaire, but also Léon Diop and Léon Damas. There was a very complicated situation to choose between the ties, the strong ties with France, no, the old colonial empire, and the commitment to the creation of new nation states. So that's a complex period also because we have these ideas of Négritude that can be conceived as a concept, as a philosophy, as a cultural movement with the Pan-Africanism movement, which was important, now, especially in the countries of the English-speaking countries, no? So we can realize this kind of contestation between those different movements. And I think that what's important to me in that term is that while Pan-Africanism was really committed to create and to the imagination of nation states, no, with the idea of sovereignty, no, with the independence, and with a kind of total autonomy from the old colonial empires. So Aimé Césaire in the Caribbean with the Martinica, and also Senghor in Senegal, they try to conceive another way of this transition. No? And there is a long debate that I'm not able also to recreate here by my own limitations, which has to do with this discussion about federalism in the West Africa. No? So, but there was a moment in which Senghor, which was a very important political figure in that transition, and also Aimé Césaire, they conceived the possibility of creating a confederation of states with France as a head, no, of this confederation. So this was a way that they conceived to achieve some kind of autonomy, to achieve really autonomy, no, in relation to the old colonial empire, but also to keep some kind of political connections with France and collaborations, no, exchange, economic exchange, and and many other kind of collaborations. So what was like behind that logic is that Senghor and Aimé Césaire, they realized that would be very difficult to the new countries, to the independent new countries, to be really independent in the economic and political order that they realized at that period. That has to do with the Cold War, no? And also with the conflicts and the domination and the emergence of an European community. So they realized how that countries, they were organized and the different pressures in the international relations. So they conceived the idea of a federation, no, to be under an umbrella of relations with France, but with political autonomy. No? So, and I think that kind of ambiguity that you can realize in the political stage, I think we can find also some connections between Senghor as a political figure and Senghor as a poet, no? Even if Senghor, he declares, and he tried to keep those dimensions separate all the time. No, he insisted in trying to keep that disconnection between both dimensions. No, and he was kind, and that's interesting because Nick Nesbitt from the Department of French and Italian has a very amazing readings about the Caribbean critical tradition. And in one of his texts about Aimé Césaire, he tried to discuss this ambiguity, or this, he called this in following Dubois, the idea of a double consciousness within the carrière d'un retour au pays natal. It's like this first and important poem, that kind of inaugurate the idea of Négritude. And he observed in the poem that kind of ambiguity. And I think that's possible to find that kind of ambiguity in Senghor's poems. And I think that's one approach that I try to do through this text is to analyze that kind of ambiguities, but the ambiguities that create some kind of openness out of the North Atlantic axis. So, and that's something really important to figure out the way that Senghor imagined relations out of this order, no? And that's the reason that there were also, of course, political reasons, no? As you realize it also in the text, like the process of the decolonization of Portuguese-speaking countries in Africa, no? Yes, also that idea about the show, how is that? About the book of Tiffany that you have mentioned?
I don't even know how to pronounce it properly. I'm gonna put it in the text, the reference.
That's very exciting. So that's a very nice idea. So I really would like to look more for this metaphor, because territory, to my reflection on this poem, on this article, but also along the dissertation, it's something very important that came from this Edward Said also reflections about intertwined stories and juxtaposed territories, no? So I'd love to read more about that. So I think that I can now, so I'm not able to answer you now, but I think that's a very powerful image that the author offers, no? Because yes, I think there are many moments of friction, I'm sure. And yes, I think that the idea of the combination between to think this overpresence of African diasporic aesthetics only in the sea is something that restrict or limited their reflection in some way. No, that's the reason also that I try to oppose, for example, this idea of poetic of forgiveness of Léopold Senghor, and the idea of the sea, the idea of the Négritude, the blood, no, but also the poetic of the Mauryan age from Abdias do Nascimento, which has to do totally in that case with the land, indeed, no, and which is also a very contemporary issue until now in Brazil, not only due to the powerful work of Abdias do Nascimento and also a recent generation of Afro-Brazilian artists, no, but also because the land indeed in Brazil is still a huge problem, no. So yeah. I think that I would try to address also, at least a little bit, Isabela, that beautiful and powerful and terrible work that you showed about Rosana Paulino. This idea of the red Atlantic, you know. So one of my references on literature about this red Atlantic is Stem and Shoah and the Race in Translation, no, in which he tried to discuss also this concept of black Atlantic in other terms. No, he tried to place that idea in connection with other territories and also with other periods. No, just to, and I think that's very interesting because it also is helpful to make other connections between artwork, no, and intellectual production. No? So, but yes, so my first thought, and I think that's important to acknowledge it, the first World Festival and this period of the 1960s, no, it's a very heteronormative and there is a very strong predominance of men in both sides of the Atlantic, you know? Even if I think that's very interesting in terms of Senghor's work, because we can discuss what kind of masculinities, for example, are at stake, you know? But I think that for Senghor, and I think that's really, we can realize that by reading the poem, but also by listening to the speech, and also the kind of politics that he proposes to create a kind of Luso-Afro-Atlantic community, no, while he was in Brazil, was not a kind of suture, no? So I have received some interesting questions also about this poem, in how interesting is that Senghor, he's avoiding all the time to use these terms like blood, no, or like the colonialism in a violent sense, no? He's always talking about meeting, encounter, no? And he's always avoiding this. And this is the way also that he read also Gilberto Freire, no? I'm finishing, sorry, Jonathan. And I think that will be very problematic to Senghor to answer an artwork like that of Rosana Paulino. That also reminds me some other works from Afro-Brazilian artists that create some kind of maps, no, in white and black by using Afro-religious elements, and they try to redesign, no, the world map. So, and I think that was less the case in that period, no, to redesign the map than to create new connections in the map that already exists. No, I think that was more, to me, a period of discovery about new connections and collaborations in this third world alliance. And I think that Senghor was very important in doing that. I think that's one of the richness of this period and Senghor's work. Sorry for the long answers. I didn't answer everything, but thank you. Amazing thoughts and amazing comments, Isabela.
No, thank you. Thank you so much. And obviously I want you to get feedback from all the amazing people that we have in the Zoom room right now. So we can open it for questions. And, you know, I'm supposed to be moderating it, but just, you know, if you have something to say, just unmute yourself and please join.
In English, Spanish, or Portuguese?
I think, Charlie, you raised your hand. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, I was trying to respect Zoom decorum.
Oh, sorry.
No, that's okay. Mao, thanks so much for this really exciting and urgent work. It's kind of remarkable to me that we haven't talked about it more over the years, but that's a fault of ours. I wanted to ask about language. I think I understood correctly in your little presentation today that you mentioned something about a Carioca pronunciation. And I was wondering how this book by Brent Edwards, Practice of Diaspora, might bear on your analysis. And the reason I ask is that one of Brent's sort of important concepts in this book, which is about diasporic exchange and translation, you know, like Stam and Shallot, but a precursor to that, is décalage, gaps or time lags or spaces in between translation. And he gets this word from none other than Senghor in the prologue. And so décalage is also an important concept for Senghor. There's a quote here that I'll read in English for the sake of nobody having to hear my French pronunciation. Despite appearances, the difference between Negro Americans and Negro Africans is more slight. In reality, it involves a simple décalage in time and space. And so I was wondering how this notion of décalage and then more broadly, Brent's work on translation and Black internationalism in the context of Harlem and Paris might bear on Senghor. And then as a follow-up question, I'm sort of intrigued by Freire being the central interlocutor for Senghor, given that, you know, how does Freire fit into the sort of diasporic imaginary or diasporic exchange that is being suggested here, you know, given, you know, in other words, just what, how is Freire's sort of fraught relationship to Blacks and the diaspora resolved in Senghor's sort of use of him or décalage of him? So anyway, thank you. I hope that sort of makes sense.
Do you want to pick up more questions or no?
Yeah, we can gather more questions if you want to, so that because we only have like half an hour left.
Yeah, I think that's a good, sorry, can I jump in?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, okay. So thank you, Mal, for sharing this fascinating paper with us today. I have actually a few questions about how the Brazilian side or the Brazilian government used also Senghor for its own purposes. I don't know if it's part of like a second chapter, because there's a second visit of Senghor in '77, right? When he visited Geisel, for example, during a change in the international relations between Africa and Brazil and a more realignment, right? For example, I know that, you know, this first visit was in '64, and the first very quick question is, I'm curious to know more about what he was doing in Porto Alegre. I know that there's an Institute Senghor called Institute Senghor in Porto Alegre, or there was, it existed in the past, and I'm curious about that. And the other question is more direct on how the Brazilian government also profited, or what was the narrative created by the Brazilian government by the visit, by Senghor's visit, because you know a very brief search on the National Archives, you can find that they followed him closely. This was after the golpe, right after the coup. He visited, I guess, in September, and then I this morning I spent some minutes trying to find something. And I could actually see that they were using him as propaganda, right? For example, when he visited the Congress, the Correio da Manhã in September 24th, 1964 wrote, Senghor says that the new constitution, the new Brazilian constitution is exemplary. And this was after the coup, right? So I'm just curious to hear you more, not only about like, more about how the Brazilian government actually had plans to use Senghor as an image, but also his poems, etc., to kind of to what kind of policy, not only external policy, but also internal policy.
Thank you, Lucas. Should I answer now?
Yeah. Does anybody have like one extra question, and then you can answer 3, or are we good to start with these?
I can ask a brief one. I can ask, Mao, just very quickly, like I'm curious because your work is so, it's interdisciplinary, what we call that in academia, right? Like, where would you inscribe it, your work? Like, what discussions are you, I guess, entering? So
3 big questions, but very important.
Okay. So, well, thank you for the questions also. And again, I will try to face the challenge. So, yes, so I just realized this Carioca pronunciation, Charlie, like in the last weeks, it's something, let's say, new to me. I think that's a very good reason to return to the discussion about the practice of diaspora in these terms of décalage. That's a very amazing discussion about the way in which African diasporic communities and African diasporic intellectuals can connect to each other. I think that the question, and I think that the book is important to realize that, is how these Francophone and Anglophone intellectuals, African-American, either African-American or African and Afro-Caribbean intellectuals, they create spaces of connections and collaborations during the 40s, 50s, but I think that's kind of different when we go to this 1960s, and we have this kind of marginal, because it was kind of marginal groups, marginalized groups from South America, in this concert, let's say, of African and Afro-diasporic intellectuals. I feel sometimes that the use of this décalage by Senghor, it's also a kind of allegory of this African family, as he uses in other moments to negotiate in some way his idea about this image rhythm, as a kind of metaphor or concept that can help us to conceive this kind of unity between communities of African and African diasporic people. That's the way that he also approaches the conversation with the Pan-Africanists during the 60s, this idea of African as a big family. I'm not sure, maybe I need to return to the book to see again how the author, he conceived the use of décalage departing from Senghor. But the way that Senghor uses the term, I think it's really strong connected with some conflicts that existed in the first and in the second second Congress of Black intellectuals. No, there were like very different positions, for example, conflicts between poets that came from North America. No, I don't remember exactly the name now. It's a very important, at least 2 or 3 important writers that were opposed to the debates furthered by Aimé Césaire, for example. No, it was kind of in that period in which Césaire was conceiving the idea of the discours sur le colonialisme. No, it was a very strong statement in that document about the internal colonialism in the United States. No, and I think that Senghor was kind of conceiving this décalage as an idea also to find a way of reconciliation again between different sides. No, and sometimes to me it's very important to observe how Aimé Césaire and Léopold Senghor they were allies. No, they have very strong alliances in these meetings, these cultural and political meetings, because these meetings were not only meetings to present different poets and the production, no, of these Black artists, but they were also very important in debates about the decolonization and the position of these groups, no, in relation to the colonial powers. So, but thank you for reminding me again the book. I would love to return also and just think more about this image about décalage. No? About the Brazilian side, this Brazilian use of, let's say, Léopold Senghor, the Brazilian reactions, let's say, to this interest of Léopold Senghor. My first reaction, Miquel, and thank you for asking this, is that Brazil were not so interested, let's say, in Africa after the coup d'etat. No, there were like a shift in the Brazilian diplomacy, not so radical as in our contemporary period. No, as we can realize under this government, but a very important one. I think there are 2 things. One, the Brazilian diplomacy, they kind of, when Senghor approached Brazil to looking for, to find collaborations and to sign agreements, it was before the coup d'etat, and there is like a strong policy toward Africa. No, that was very important to Brazil, especially under the government of João Goulart. But it was part of a reflection, not only in the Brazilian government, but also among Brazilian intellectuals. No, this was under this reflection about the third world alliances. No, so and there were very important intellectuals in the Brazilian context, in Rio de Janeiro, and also in São Paulo, thinking about that, and with connections within the Brazilian government. No, what happened is that Senghor's visit occurs in the moment of that transition. Let's say we are in the shadow of this Brazilian policy toward Africa. No, and I think that's the reason that Senghor is still able to create, no, some kind of some very bright visit. No, he visited many cities. No, but I can tell you the visit was they changed the visit like 2 or 3 times. No, and it was like due to the Brazilian less interest in this connection with Africa. No, but finally he visited indeed. I have no idea about this institute in Porto Alegre. I would love. I think that maybe it has to do with the idea of Senghor as a kind of leader for the third world, someone that was like connected with Catholic intellectuals in Brazil, no, thinking about the African socialism and the alliances toward a third world. No, I think that probably maybe this is a kind of institute that has some connection with political ideas of Senghor, because the aesthetics ideas of Senghor, they are less known in Brazil, and I think that there is like a kind of very discreet reception about Senghor ideas in aesthetics. No, I think to Brazil was very important because Senghor were also pushing Brazil to defend the decolonization of the Portuguese-speaking countries. No, and there were a conflict in the Brazilian diplomacy. No, I think that Jerry Dávila, no, is a historian from Brown, I think, that has a book in which he described more like this political side of Senghor's presence in Brazil. That has to do on one side with this, with the decolonization, no, of the Portuguese speaking countries and Africa on one side, and the other side with the connections of Senghor with the Catholic intellectuals. So one of the speeches were like at PUC, no, and the cohort that was there, one of the persons was one of the responsibles for the diplomacy of the Brazilian government. No, so you can find the circulation of these key figures from the Brazilian diplomacy, like in the speeches and in the places that Senghor visit. No, Senghor visit, like he visit important cultural institutions. No, in Rio de Janeiro, Academia Brasileira de Letras, no, the most important institution related to writers in Brazil, and many different universities, São Paulo, Bahia, which was like the place in which Senghor feels more familiar to do and to deliver his speeches. No. And he was more discreet, and he tries to undermine the importance of the economic and political issues in the agenda. No? Yeah, I think Charlie also asked about Gilberto Freire, right? Charlie, sorry, I forgot to mention that. And yes, I think that's one of the most interesting things to me in the article, because I think Senghor, he created a very creative, let's say, reading about Gilberto Freire's ideas, no? And that's what I try also to follow, no, in the text. So on one side, I think that it's important to realize the difference between this idea of racial democracy as a kind of racial exceptionalism. No, the Brazilian is a kind of society in which a long colonial contact create zones of convivence, coexistence, in which the outcome are more harmonic relations between different races, which was like precisely the big problem, no, of the period. No, they were dealing with different process of segregation, decolonization, and the after of this Second World War. No, so this Brazil was a kind of one of these civilized options, no, laboratories and models to these segregated societies. But I think that is what I try to trace a little bit, is this difference between Brazil as a model, and which is in part, not only, but it's in part, no, due to the ideas of Gilberto Freire, which was the most like well-known intellectual about that, but there were many others, including Black intellectuals also. So there is a very complex and conflictive tradition. But also, I think that's very important to understand the Luso-tropicalism as a kind of derivation of this Brazilian model, and the uses of this Luso-tropicalism as a kind of colonial knowledge by the Portuguese empire. No? In the moment in which most part of the countries in Africa, they were achieving a decolonization and independence, no? But that not happen in the Portuguese-speaking countries, no? The independence in that countries will only find a solution in the 70s, right? And I think that's one important thing is to realize the difference between these ideas of racial democracy and Luso-tropicalism, the derivation of this idea, the circulation and the uses, and the way that Senghor select, let's say, the racial democracy, no, to talk, and not the Luso-tropicalism, no? Senghor never addressed directly the idea of Luso-tropicalism, which other intellectuals, such as the Angolan writer Mário Pinto de Andrade, did in Presença Africaine, no? But Senghor, he kind of deviate, so that's the idea, no? And he approached the discussion about racial democracy in terms of the Brazilian model, and he tried to expand the idea. He kind of he create another derivation, let's say. If Gilberto Freire was able to create a derivation from racial democracy to Luso-tropicalism as a kind of colonial knowledge, no, or colonial device, I think Senghor was looking for that tradition, but he read in a way that was a possible answer to the independence of those countries, not to the dependence as Gilberto Freire is proposed. Because Gilberto Freire, the idea was Africa is still like this Brazil in first age. So that's the reason that the Portuguese need to be there, no, to help to create this Brazil. No? And Senghor, he kind of invert this idea, no, proposing that the independence will indeed cultivate that kind of connection between Portugal and the Portuguese-speaking countries. Yeah.
And there was Jonathan's question, right? Or yeah.
Jonathan's. Oh, that's very. I even take a note of that, Jonathan, because that's very difficult to answer. Thank you, Isabela, for reminding me. Well, you know, I can see Pedro Meira, my advisor, like right away here. So it's a very delicate question. Not for that, of sure, because I think that, well, one of the provocative persons in my life that pushed me to transgress the disciplinary boundaries, that's Pedro, no doubt. So how can I answer that? So I think that I have a background, I have a background in the social science and anthropology, you know? Pedro is laughing, so I'm not sure about that now, if I still have this background in anthropology. And in that previous experience, I already deal with literature, with visual arts, with cinema. No, I think that in part has to do with a very local, let's say, tradition from the Brazilian field, no, at the São Paulo, enfim. There is a whole debate about that tradition and the social thought in Brazil that engage social sciences and literature, right? I think that's in my backbone, no? And once I start my PhD at Princeton, then it was like a perfect place to flourish, no, to blossom, let's say, that kind of interdisciplinary. So I'm only looking for ways to answer that question precisely, Jonathan, when I'm applying, let's say, for a job position. Because indeed, I think what I learned now also in the Princeton experience is that kind of connection that we have right now, no, with like Isabela from, no, art history, reading and proposing different ways to looking for my materials. And that's also the way that I experience the different disciplines, no, and the different programs, Brazil Lab, the program in Latin American Studies, no? And as they supported, let's say, that kind of research, so I just try to develop more and more, you know, in that term. So I really like to circulate among the different disciplines.
I wasn't really referring to like the very rigorous and outdated academic disciplines per se. I've meant more like intellectually speaking. So you're addressing an issue from very like many different angles, right? I'm asking you like what precisely is that? Say for example, I've seen people that do environmental justice and like almost to state the importance of why literature is important to like say like address that issue, right? Why? So that's more of what I meant. Like, what is that? Like, if you had to choose that field, I guess, what would it be? Like, why are you approaching it in this way? You know?
Okay, nice. Okay, so I think that I try to keep a balance between some questions posed by different fields and also the challenge of the interpretation, no, and the challenge of that the material offers. I think that also my problem was to create a kind of analysis and interpretation of this festival. How this connect to my scholarly work? So this connect to my scholarly work in the way that I try to map, understand, analyze subaltern intellectual practice and African diasporic practice. So practice and aesthetics. I think that's, let's say, in a very rough answer, no? So that's what I do. That's what I did through the work of also the capoeira, no? This Afro-Brazilian martial art. And the way that that kind of practice connects with politics, with art, and with literature. So that kind of entanglements. The festival, it's like a huge event. So I was able to approach in many ways. What I decided to do is to looking for the zones of silence connected to the Afro-Brazilian experience. Oh, and that's the reason, for example, for this article. So Senghor, there is a huge bibliography and literature about Senghor in connection with French modernism, no? Surrealism, no? Or the African American tradition in the North Atlantic, no? The international meetings, the different ways that they engage with the Harlem Renaissance and other important political, historical, and cultural movements in the North Atlantic axis. What excited me was to realize how those intellectuals were also looking for ways to engage other zones of this African diasporic experience. And as I come from the Brazilian field, I'm looking for this connection, and the connections also not only Brazil, which can be also an issue per se, but also the Lusophone world. So that's the reason that I try to engage Gilberto Freire, for example, Senghor, two like huge figures, with Mário Pinto de Andrade from Angola, right? So try to looking for that kind of connections between these African diasporic intellectuals. I think that I didn't answer the question yet, but but you let me know.
Well, we have about like 10 minutes, so we can collect another round of questions or commentaries, you know, feedback.
I think Jonathan will ask the same thing, no?
I mean, I have some other commentaries, but I have already spoken for a long time. So I want to give the chance to anybody that wants to chime in or, you know, any comments. Well, maybe then, I mean, I do have one extra question. I saw online that you are having this project But I don't know if this is something that is still carrying, or that's called A Communal Poem Map of Afro-Diasporic Aesthetics, where you talk about this chapter, right? But then it's kind of like a digital humanities project. And this is where you bring sound very much directly, right? And I was wondering, you know, what came first, or how these ideas developed. And I was very intrigued in how you then, you know, are creating what you call a poem map, right? And, you know, that's so interesting. I mean, these are the types of projects in the digital humanities that are really worth it. So if, you know, how did you conceive of that project in relation to this, and what came first? How do you think about the poem map, and what do you envision for it?
Well, Isabella, thank you for asking this also, because yes, this is a kind of parallel project, no? And this, I developed this idea like after the work with the poem, no? I conceived this project some months ago during the summer, no? And it was the moment in which I was finishing, no, this chapter, no, not the article, but the chapter. And I think, yes, I was very thrilled for working with this poem, no, and I start to figure out how other people from different places around, no, the Afro-Atlantic territories would react to the readings today. So that was my first, let's say, question, no? So what would be like different readings from people? Because Senghor conceived this poem as a kind of dialogue between, you know, different places around this Afro-Atlantic world. The poem is dedicated to someone from Portugal, but he mentions, no, different places. And I was really intrigued in how the people would read this poem today. So that was like, let's say, the first thought. And then came the question of translation, so that I can return to the question of the translations, because I was a challenge to me to work with the poem in French, no? And I don't have any reflection about the translation to the Portuguese, but I don't like the translation from French to Portuguese. And then I was curious in how can we translate a poem in other languages than, let's say, French, Portuguese, or English, no? But a translation in a virtual setting, which that's the main idea of the project. How can we translate the poem in a virtual setting? No? And the idea of build up a poem map has to do in part with the land imaginations that Senghor addressed through the poem, no? And how would be that different lands imagined, no, or feel, no, by different people in different places. Let's say Brazil, one place, but also United States and France and Senegal and Angola. So, and my idea is just to finish, let's say, a first step of this project with different couples of colleagues that will read this, the poem, and give some feedbacks, ideas of how can we translate this in a virtual setting by using images, sounds, or any other kind of device that we can imagine in this life that we have in Zoom now. And how can we create sensibilities by using these tools and technologies? So this is a very experimental project to me. It's very new because I'm very systematic, let's say, in doing my scholarly work. So that's kind also of different experimentation to keep connected with the poem and to have the poem as a device to connect people in different places. No? But not in the sense of reconciliation only, but also conflicts, tensions, décalage, misunderstandings. So all these things I'm very interested in give some kind of visibility. No?
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I mean, we are on time now, but maybe let Senghor's reconciliation spirit guide us through this weekend. And I don't know if Jonathan, you have some closing words, or Mauricio.
No, just thank you so much. There are, so Michael has to run, but there are some end of semester events at the Brazil Lab, so please check them out. Especially the conference that looks very, very promising, or that it will be incredible. So we look forward to seeing you then. Thank you so much for joining us today. Y gracias, Mal.
Bye bye. Thank you
very much.
Gracias. Obrigado, Mal. And
Valeu,
Isabela.
Bye.
Ciao.
Ciao.